Okay, welcome everybody to the first installment of our four-part series, Our Holy Land. I apologize that you may have to share a source sheet. There's about 12 of them and many more of you, so I really appreciate everyone coming out on this very exciting evening. This would be a zechus for the team to win tonight, God willing. There's obviously more important things, but I think we could get excited a little bit about our team. I can say our team, is that okay? Even though I'm only here 5 years, it's okay? Own part of it? I don't own part of it. No, I don't own any part of it. So this is our first part of our lecture series, Our Holy Land, exploring the spiritual history of our most sacred places in the land of Israel. And tonight, we are going to explore the holy city of Tzefat. And I'm not sure how much we'll get through tonight. I'm hoping that we're going to pick another city throughout the series to discuss, but it really kind of depends on where we go with this. As many of you know, I have a love and a passion for history, and we'll probably touch on a number of different periods, because in the past we focused on characters in history, then we focused a little bit on periods of time, and now we're going to try to focus on a place and use that place sort of as a launching pad. And that place that I want to discuss tonight is Tzefat. So Tzefat is a very, very mysterious, mystical, very interesting place. There's obviously, when you talk about a place, you could talk about thousands of years, but I'm going to pick a few different periods that are very well known and focus on those. Probably the most famous period of Tzfat's history is the 16th century of we call it maybe the period of the mystics. Now, people know of Tzfat as, it's a mystical city, it has a lot of holy energy and different things, but the truth is there were also great halachists, great legal codifiers. We know that Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, he lived in Tzfat. We're going to talk a little bit about his Rabbi and his teacher and who gave him smicha, and a whole controversy about that as well. Just to list you a few of the people who lived in Tzfat in that time period. Rav Yitzchak Luria, Rav Isaac Luria, known as the Arizal. Rav Chaim Vital, who was one of his closest students. We'll talk about him. There is Rav Moshe Alshich, Rav Moshe Cordovero, or often referred to as the Ramak, the author of the Tomer Dvara. Rav Yaakov Beirav, or the Mahari Beirav, who is the one I just mentioned before, the teacher of the Beis Yosef, or Rav Yosef Karo, who gets into a major controversy about renewing smicha, renewing ordination, which we're going to talk about tonight. Rav Yosef Karo, author of the Shulchan Aruch and other Kabbalistic works. Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, who was the author of the Lechadodi prayer. The Ma'abit, Rav Moshe Detrani. All of these spiritual giants lived in the same city with the same, we would say small by today's standards, but we'll see that probably, a few thousand people. It's hard to know exactly, but not a huge amount. But they were all living in this concentrated, small city in the north of Israel. Very interesting. How did they get there? How did they get to this city? So we don't always know how these things work. Historians, we spoke about in the Religious Zionism series, historians talk about the early aliyah of the students of the Baal Shem Tov and the students of the Vilna Gaon. But here we actually have an earlier aliyah, which was the aliyah, maybe I would call it, of Tikkun Leil Shavuot. What do I mean by the aliyah of Tikkun Leil Shavuot? So, we know about this from a number of different sources. I'm going to read part of a commentary written by the Shalah HaKadosh. But there is a recording of a mystical experience that happened in Salonika, which is located in the northern part of the Greek area of Macedonia in the Ottoman Empire, in 1533. In 1533, we have a gathering of teachers. If you know a little bit about Tikkun Leil Shavuos, what we do today is very, I could say what I do, my stepfather, who's a real Breslover chassid, by the way, Breslov is a very strong connection to Tzefat. My stepfather, he actually does the tikkun. What is the tikkun? The tikkun is really it means like sort of a rectification. We'll see. We'll talk a lot about the Kabbalistic notion of tikkun. But it's sort of a compilation of different things. There's a collection. I don't even know everything that's in there, but there's a collection of psukim and tehillim, and that's the tikkun. So where does that tikkun come from? So it comes from, apparently, an all-night study session that Rabbi Yosef Karo and his companions of Shlomo Alkabetz, they gathered together on Shavuos, and in that spiritual gathering, there was a revelation that there was, again, a lot of these things, we're going to just read some of the texts and hear some of the stories. Do I really understand it? Not really. Not really. I have to be honest with you. Today is an interesting foray into some mystical stories and some mysteries. But what we do know, the facts are the facts. Rav Yosef Karo and his group end up in Tzefat. How do they end up there? They tell us that there was a Magid, there was an angel that spoke to Rav Yosef Karo or through him, as he was sort of possessed in some way, and he had this spiritual revelation on this Leil Shavuot in 1533, and this is recorded in Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz's work, the Shalah HaKadosh, the Shnei Luchos HaBris, and you can take a look at this in source number 1. He says that in this night, Siddur Limud Shalzu Alayla, Kvar Nisparsim, this Tikkun Leil Shavuot is already well known of what you're supposed to learn, not what necessarily what he's not referring to what we do. We stay up all night, and some people go to interesting classes. And there's a funny bit on some comedians they put out there about outrageous shir titles, like Rashi, the Paraduma, January 6th. What does the Chok have to do with President Trump? Or is it just ridiculous titles to get people to come to shir? It's a funny bit if you haven't seen it. I think Ari or Ami Kozak or something. He's a interesting guy. He has a funny bit on Tikkun Leil Shavuos. But I digress. So he says here that everyone knows about this practice, and it's already become well, in Minhag Zeh and Hispashi B'chol Eretz Yisrael, in all of the land of Israel. We've heard about this idea that we stay up and we learn mystical ideas, and we read about these different holy and mystical experiences on Shavuos. And he says, what does this come from? He says, well, I'm going to write to you about a story that happened in our times. He's talking about, in the 16th century, that happened with Rav Shlomo Alkabetz in the home of Rabbeinu Beis Yosef, where he experienced Ruach HaKodesh. And this is what the tradition says. So, basically, I'm just going to summarize this, but basically, they were learning these different Mishnayos. Ube'ez shehis chalanu l'ilmud haMishnah v'lamdinu shtei mesechtos. We learned these two different tractates, and all of a sudden, zachinu borenu v'nishma es kol ha'medaber b'pi ha'chosid niro kol gadol. He's talking about the Beis Yosef. All of a sudden we heard a voice speaking through Rav Yosef Karo, and it was this. We got all scared. This booming voice, and he says that we fell on our faces, and we were very afraid of what was happening here. Right? He says we couldn't look at him. We were afraid to look at him, and because of his great experience, we collapsed. And what did this voice say? What did this voice say? So, just skipping ahead because this is a sort of a long period and we have a lot to cover. He says, "V'alum le'eretz Yisrael." The voice who's speaking sort of through Rav Yosef Karo, who's this, he calls him this great Ruach HaKodesh, this great divine spirit, says, "Go up to Eretz Yisrael. Alum le'eretz Yisrael. Kilo kol ha'itim shavos. Not all times are equal. V'im ma'atzor lo'hoshia berov o b'mat." That not all times are equal, and to succeed at going to Eretz Yisrael, and now is the time to go up to the land of Israel. And they record, the Shalah and others record, that following this event, Rav Yosef Karo of Shlomo Alkabetz and his kibbutz, his group of chevra, his Kabbalistic chevra, go up to Eretz Yisrael, and where do they settle? They settle in the city called Tzefat. So that's, again, everything's clouded in mystery. What exactly does it mean that the Spirit spoke through him? He writes a whole sefer. Rav Yosef Karo has a sefer called the Magid Mesharim, which are recollections of what this angel taught him. So we learn part of his corpus, which is the Shulchan Aruch, and that's where we get a lot of our Jewish laws from. But we have to understand that he was also a great mystic. Okay. What I referred to earlier is, what was this great controversy that emerged very shortly after this group makes their way to Tzfat? So the great Smicha debate, it's referred to as the Smicha debate, or the Pulmas HaSmicha, it occurred in 1538. So about, we said 1533, so 5 years later, it only takes them 5 years, they're already embroiled in a massive debate. What exactly happened here? So this debate really circles around one figure, and I mentioned him before. His name is the Ma'ari Beirav, or Rav Yaakov Beirav, and he decides at some point to renew the concept of ordination. Now, ordination should not be confused with the smicha that we have today, where rabbis go through a program, they take a test, and they're given a certain certificate that says, you have smicha. This is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is renewing a process that really was the first given from Moshe Rabbeinu to Yehoshua, and subsequently, besides for this interesting reenactment or temporary reinvigoration, it's pretty much been lost.
When did it cease? Men of the Great Assembly?
So we'll see. We'll see a Rambam that talks about this. The Rambam is a focal point of this discussion, but just to understand a little bit of the background of who this fellow Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, who he was. So here's a little bit of a bio. There's also just a little picture there of the place and where he's buried in Tzfat. So Beirav, or Beirab, is really an honorary title that's often given to Talmud Torah scholars. His family name, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but is Marmaran, and he originated from Spain. And after the Spanish Inquisition, which is going to be a major impact on this discussion, so bear in mind, in the back of your mind, that many of these people were expelled recently, and the Spanish Inquisition was really the end of the metropolis of Jewish life. Spain was the center, and now we're sort of in the aftermath of this tragic destruction that we literally are, in the 20, 30 years after a terrible, or maybe even say 40, 50, a terrible, really closing of an era. And that's where he originated from. He wandered around with other thousands of other Jews, and eventually he arrives at a town in North Africa. He gives some shiurim there, and he doesn't stay long in this northern Africa, in Egypt. Eventually goes to Jerusalem, and there he interacts with an interesting fellow who's going to appear very soon, referred to as the Maralbach. The Maralbach, Rav Levi ibn Habib, who was the chief rabbi and the head of the rabbinical court in Jerusalem, and they don't really seem to get along. They have a lot of differences of opinion, and they kind of set their paths don't really cross until they do later on. He then, after he goes on a lot of different journeys, eventually makes his way back to the holy city of Tzfat and settles in Tzfat. At that time, there was probably around 1,000. I mentioned we don't know exactly, but around 1,000 families, living in the Jewish city of Tzfat. And right away, Rav Yaakov Beirav is seen as this great Talmudic scholar, and he's appointed as the chief rabbi of Tzfat. All of this, by the way, a lot of these sources, it's always important to tell you where my sources are from. So a lot of this is recorded in a work referred to as the Smichas Zikanim, which was published by the Maharal Bach, who we'll see was the great antagonist of the Maharibei Rav. And there's hundreds of letters that go back between the two of them. At a certain point, we'll see in a moment this halachic discussion. At a certain point, the Maharibei Rav decides to restart the concept of smicha, and he assumes that people are going to all be very excited about this and accept it and be proud of it. And he writes a few letters. One letter he writes to a student of his, Rav Moshe de Castro, and the other letter he writes to his acquaintance, who he disagreed with on a number of different things, but his acquaintance, the Maharal Bach, Rav Levi ibn Chabiv. It seems that he was aware there may have been some resistance coming, because he kind of, asks his student, the Rav Moshe de Castro, to sort of assist him, and he basically gives the Maharal Bach smicha. So remember, he's writing from Tzefat to Jerusalem, to the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, and he's saying, I've restarted this concept of smicha. As we'll see in a second, the Rambam has there's fertile ground based on the Rambam to restart smicha, and he gives him, I hereby issue you this smicha, which goes back from Moshe Rabbeinu. He gives this smicha to the Maharal Bach, and the Maharal Bach refuses to accept it, and this breaks out with a whole controversy, and eventually Maharal Bach, because he opposes him, as we'll see in a moment, it has to be unanimous. If there's not unanimous agreement, then it doesn't really have effect. And eventually, Maharibei Rav has to flee and has to run away. And that's a little bit how the Maharal Bach prevents the restarting of smicha. So what did I just mentioned the Rambam in passing. So let's look a little bit at the Rambam. And to talk about a little bit the halachic discussion before we move on to the story between Maharal Bach and Maharibei Rav. So the Rambam writes in two different places. One place in his Perush HaMishnayos in Sanhedrin, another place in Hilchos Sanhedrin in Mishnah Torah. The Rambam writes as follows. In source number 2, he says that Yirali. He says, Kishetia hasmicha ha'asamcha mikoach hachamim v'hatalmidim lahaktim aleim ish min yeshiva. He says, if it were that all the chachamim get together and they decide to appoint somebody to give them this traditional smicha, he says it appears to him that there should be a possibility. The Rambam is basically wondering, why was it that this went out of practice? Why did we lose the concept of smicha? And he says, if all the chachamim get together and decide to appoint somebody, it shouldn't be a problem. And that person could go ahead and give other people smicha. He says, Lo tamar, he says, don't say that it's here. He says it a little bit more clearly over here. In source number 3, you could take a look at it in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Yud Aleph, Halacha Yud Aleph. He says that in Eretz Yisrael there was no judge who had smicha. It stopped. However, he says, Niran li advarim shem hiskimu kol hachachamim sheberetz Yisrael lemanos dayanim. He says, it appears to me that if all the chachamim got together and gave someone smicha, they could reenact dinei kenosos. Dinei kenosos are fine, certain things that in halacha you're not able to enact if you don't have a beis din, and they would have the ability to give others to smicha, other ordination to other chachamim. Imkain lamo hayu chachamim mitztarin al smicha. He's not sure. Why were they so upset? Why were they so? The rabbis were in so much distress that they couldn't do smicha, that they couldn't do kenosos, they couldn't enact these fines, these penalties. It must be because they were so spread out. And the efshar sheyaskimu kulan. In other words, the Rambam's saying, and this is what he writes in Perush HaMishnayos, it's the same type of thing, is if in fact it's just up to consensus, if the rabbis decide they could continue giving someone who's reliable, who's seemingly fit to have smicha, if it's just sort of a consensus, why were they so pained and so frustrated that they couldn't enact these certain laws? They should just decide to do it. So he says it must be that everyone was so spread out, it was impossible to get consensus. There was no centralized authority. But if there was somebody who had that smicha, then they would be able to start doing these, making these enactments and these financial penalties. And he says at the end, V'davar tzarech hechreya. This question requires further resolution or further efforts. In other words, the Rambam is saying it just seems to be happenstance that the Jewish people were so spread out because of the Gullus, and they didn't have centralized authority, so they weren't able to create a consensus. But have they been able to? There seems to be no problem. Because based on this, it's Rav Yaakov Rav decides to, we have a possibly never before in history do we have such a centralized, strong rabbinic group. As we mentioned, there's Rav Yosef Karo, Rav Moshe Alshech, the Ma'abit, Rav Maribe Rav, the Arizal, all these great figures all in one place at the same time. Let's restart Smicha. The Rambam left it open. He pretty much just said, we just don't have centralized authority. Now, what was the reason that they decided to do this? All of a sudden, let's make new Smicha. So, this is also part of the question. The mystery, and many try to interpret different reasons. Was it a rivalry between the rabbis in Jerusalem and Tzefat, the Maralbach, his old rival, and it's about a power struggle? It doesn't really seem to be the case. I should mention that I listened to a class that Rev Aaron Lopiansky gave on this topic, which he discusses the Kuntras, the Smichas Sekenim, and sort of his theories as to what was the opposition about this. And to understand the opposition, we have to understand why they did it in the first place. And all of this is all recorded in this Sefer, in the original letters, but it's unclear exactly what's happening. So I'll tell you a little bit about the theories. So first of all, why did he start to do it? So the argument that he makes to reenact Smicha is that, remember, the Spanish Inquisition, and many Jews were persecuted, and many Jews were actually threatened if they didn't convert on pain of death, that they would be killed. So that they were threatened, and many Jews decided that they would protect themselves and convert rather than die. So the argument was that now, 50 years later, these Jews are coming back and saying, we want to come back to the community, but we don't have a way to become Bali Tshuva. We don't have a way to repent. Because the halacha is that the law is, if a person does avodah zarah, if they worship an idol, or in this case they consider themselves to be idol worshippers because they worship the avodah zarah, they're chayiv kares. They're chayiv to whatever this means exactly. It's hard to understand, but it's a very serious spiritual excision or some. It doesn't come from the courts, but it comes from God, and they wanted to sort of cleanse themselves of this terrible guilt that they had. And one way to do it is to get lashes. Now, how could they get lashes? They have to have a court. In order to have a court, they have to have smicha. So you see how far... So this rabbi had this interesting theory, and this became a whole halachic dispute. Before it gets personal, it's really a halachic dispute. He says, well, I want to be able to give these people the ability to, free themselves of this guilt. Jewish guilt, trying to get rid of it a little bit at a time over the years. And if I can get us to reenact a smicha, to make a real beis din, to make a real court, then they could be freed of this guilt. Now, the Maralbach says, you got to be careful. If you make a real court and reinstate smicha, you may have to do kiddush hachodesh. Your beis din has to decide when the months happen, and then maybe some people won't know. They're going to get into really big problems because some people are holding a Pesach on different days, and you have chametz, and you have Yom Kippur. He's like, slow down. You don't know you're messing with fire over here. And more than that, he says, the whole thing, they're going to come to us and tell us that they did avodah zarah. Ein adam misamatz marasha. You can't make yourself into a wicked person. Basically, your testimony in court can't self-incriminate. Yeah. Exactly, Paul. So this whole thing that they're gonna come and they're gonna feel guilty and you have to expel them from help them cleanse themselves. The whole thing doesn't even get off the ground, and you're playing with fire, and don't do it. the Maharibe Rav, he said, well, it's for the tshuva process. You can do it. It's not for punishment. It's just for them to let go of their guilt. Very interesting to think about that psychologically. So that's I would call this I don't want to say it's a straw man. This is what they write, but there's got to be something deeper. It's not just a halachic debate over here. And some of the theories are as follows. I'll just share with you the theories. This is Rav Aaron Lopiansky's his analysis. I mentioned to you before, the academics understand it to be this old rivalry between Jerusalem and Tzefat. It doesn't really seem to make sense. If you look at some of the letters here, the correspondence becomes so sharp, so personal, that it's hard. It's hard to even repeat it. I'll read a few lines from here, and this is in the end of the Shalos HaTshuvas Mahal Bach. Sorry, not Mari Birav, Mahal Bach. It's called Kuntras HaSmicha. It's at the end of his responsa. He writes here as follows. There's a lot of credential waving, like I'm more credentialed than you, and I'm greater, and this. So he says here, I see that you wrote this letter to me. This is the Mahal Bach, the one in Jerusalem. What was his name again? Ibn Chaviv. What was his first name? That's sorry. Mahal Bach was Rav Levi Ibn Chaviv. So Rav Levi Ibn Chaviv writes that I received this letter from you, from Rav Yaakov Beirav, Mari Beirav, and he says that you wrote like this. You wrote that, I never changed my name. Lo nishtanish me. And he says, Sof Davar, Rotzalomar Shalom Nischalo Shem Shemayim Al Yado. That in other words, he's saying what you wrote to me. You wrote that I never was desecrated God's name, and the Bishum Achas Miha Osios Kadeshalo Ya'alu Shamayim Hisroyim Alai, that heaven's name was not desecrated through any of the letters of his name. Ubemakum Shahayilo Lachachim Lahodas Ala Emes Ulahashiv Kehalacha Garm Lishvok Dami. He says these words are he says Ala Emes Ulahashiv Kehalacha. I have to respond to them, but Garam Lishvok Dami. It's causing me to spill my own blood, Ulahalbin Panim, and to whiten my face. Behazchiro Elu Avonos Rishonim. When there's evil. When there's the sins or the original sins that are mentioned here, and then he says, "I'm very hurt, and all my life, I've been dedicating myself to God," and he says, "And I was not even old enough to become. I wasn't a bar onshim bebased in klal. I was never someone who could be punished in court. What in the world is going on over here? What is he saying?" So, Rav Lopiansky points out. I'm assuming he has a historical basis for this. He says the Mahal Bach converted to Catholicism, Christianity, when he was young. And the Maharibe Rav was questioning him, saying, you're somebody who left the faith. And he's responding to him and he's saying, how could you say this about me? I wasn't old enough to be responsible, and I've dedicated my life to Judaism. It became a personal attack. So what's underneath all this? So there are different theories. I think this is the most logical theory, and that is, again, to understand the context is the Spanish Inquisition. And whenever there's a terrible tragedy in the Jewish people, what often happens? After the tragedy, what do we want? Who do we want to come? Mashiach. Yes. We want Mashiach to come. So, what some understood the Maharibe Rav's excitement over the entertain the possibility of reenacting Smicha is we're preparing the road towards the Messiah. If we can gather consensus, if we can reinstate Smicha, then we could have a Sanhedrin. If we could have a Sanhedrin, then we could then bring the Sanhedrin to Beis HaMikdash, and then we could bring Mashiach. So, he doesn't say this outright, but there was this feeling that if we can start the process of reenacting Smicha, then we can be on the road towards redemption. And we have a theory, it's not just historians. Rabbi Lopiansky pointed out that there are letters where the Mahar Bach says about two things that he says I can credit myself for in my life. There are two things I'm very proud of. He says, one thing that I did, which I'm very proud of, is, he says, I stopped these besuros hashotim. What exactly are besuros hashotim? These foolish news things. It's a reference to false messiahs. I was able to put a stop to false messiahs. There was a major, again, always whenever there's tragedy, there's always false messianic leanings. And he says, I'm very proud of the fact that I stopped the smicha. So he puts those two things together, which lead people to think that he saw Maribe Rav's excitement over the reenactment of smicha as messianism. And he says, I put a stop to it, and I was able to prevent it from happening, which he felt very strongly about. And it wasn't just, yes, if things got personal, it's hard to understand it, but there was an underlying debate. Now, it's very interesting that whenever you have like the most major machlokes and conflicts in our history, in many, many, many cases, it circles around this question of messianism. What do I mean? Well, this is one of the first. What's another major fiasco in the Jewish community in terms of false messiahs? Shabtai Tzvi. Shabtai Tzvi, and then we have the debate that rips apart the Jewish world, Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, where they're really arguing over which ones is really a Sabbatean. And then we have, you could really group this together as well as how to respond to messianism, the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov, which we spoke about last time. And we could even, if we could be so far and be so bold to suggest that it's also connected to a big debate, which is still going on today, which is Mizrahi, or we'll call religious Zionism, and the Haredim, which is how do we look at the approach to the road towards redemption or moving history forward? How do we try to act upon history, or are we just we're in exile and we just have to wait it out? So Maribe Rav, was claimed against him perhaps that you're trying to push history in a direction, and the Marabach says no. Yes, we are in shambles. Yes, we're all in pain, and yes, there's a terrible tragedy. But don't be caught up with this false messianism of trying to move history in a direction. And again, I'm oversimplifying, but many terrible debates that really split the Jewish people and continue to split the Jewish people. It's really about the central question of how does Klal Yisrael respond to history changing? Do we just hold on to a fossilized, oversimplifying, but just hold on to what we know and what we can trust and what we had, but not try to change anything? Or can we start to begin the process of preparing the road towards Mashiach? Wow, okay, that took me longer than I expected. But that is the basic debate of the Smicha debate in the 16th century. Another core person we have to mention, we're talking about Tzefat, is the Arizal, Rav Yitzchak Luria. Rav Yitzchak Luria lived between 1534 and 1572. Fascinating, very, very short lifetime. And he only lives in Tzfas for 2 years. Wow. Fascinating. 2 years. He's a child born in 1534 in Yerushalayim, and eventually his father passes very young, and he moves back to Cairo in Egypt. And as we mentioned before, a lot of mystics found their way in the 16th century to Tzfat. In 1555, he gets his hands on a Zohar. And the Zohar was already revealed at this point in history, but the Arizal opens up the Zohar. Again, as I mentioned before, I'm not an expert in these things. I don't really know what this means, but the Arizal, he what's referred to as a Giloy Eliyahu, he has this great revelation, and he has a new approach, a new way to learn Kabbalah. And there's a lot of lore and mystery around him as well. But that's the basic, sort of the basic small story. He dies at the age of 38. He finds in Tzfat the Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, and he joins his circle. And eventually they realize after a few months that he's so great, he should be the one that teaching us. And he becomes the leader of this group again for under 2 years. And he teaches, and he doesn't write anything down. He writes a few small Shabbos tunes, we could call them. Mystical Shabbos tunes, Azamra B'Shvachin, Asadr Usudasa, B'nei Hechala. Those are the things that he writes. Everything else is all orally transmitted to Rav Chaim Vital. Rav Chaim Vital is the great student, really the repository of all of the Arizal's Torah. We wouldn't have any of it if not for Rav Chaim Vital. And he writes them all down in a work called the Eitz Chaim. To summarize just a few ideas about the Arizal and the ideas that he promulgated, as we know, we have a very, very sharp, hard cutoff at whatever it is, 2 to 8, so people could get back to watch the game. So he transformed, as I mentioned, the ways that people learn Kabbalah. He promulgated the idea of Gilgulim. Gilgulim is reincarnation. It means that someone dies, they can be reborn in a different body, in a different lifetime, and in sort of the same neshama. He argued that Korach, who is the great, terrible, figure in the Torah who rebels against Moshe Rabbeinu, he argued he was one of the greatest tzaddikim of a previous Gilgal. He has a basic idea of tikkun. It's often referred to as Lurianic Kabbalah, which often it's an idea of tikkun. Tikkun is that it's taking the again, this is all very, very oversimplified, but it's taking the different spiritual sparks in the world and rectifying them. And an idea that I personally found to be, I would say, very enlightening when I had the chance to learn from someone who was really an expert in this realm of thought, Rabbi David Aaron, who he shared this idea of tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is a very important Kabbalistic notion, which is how did the finite world become created? If you have an infinite being, how could there be limited beings that come out of this infinite oneness? Is there some sort of separation? Is there some sort of creator and the creation? If we believe everything's one, so how can we have an infinite being create anything that's finite? So to answer this question, I'm summarizing a lot here, but basically there have been different responses by philosophers and different theories. Something called pantheism. Pantheism is that basically the world existence itself is God. So God minus the world is zero. We don't believe that is the true the emes, but that was an idea that was promulgated that tried to explain that God is in creation because God is creation. It's all one, and that's called pantheism. I'm simplifying different philosophical theories, but that's one idea. An idea that Rav Kook writes about, and building on the Arizal's formulation, is an idea of panentheism. Panentheism is that, like we mentioned, God pervades all of existence, but then is also beyond. So pantheism, but panentheism is that God is both immanent, but also transcends creation, transcends the world. And this is all, and Rav Kook writes about this, and interestingly enough, this was influential in a number of different psychologists, thinkers. Jung writes about this in his letters. He writes that, this is a quote from the collected writers of Jung, Carl Jung, "Only a few weeks ago I came across this impressive doctrine of Lurianic tikkun, which gives meaning to man's status exalted by the incarnation." I don't really know what was so impactful. I don't know. I'm not an expert in Jung. I'm not an expert in Arizal. But there were people who were reading this and were very impacted by this idea. I have a few summaries from a number of different thinkers. I mentioned Rav Kook. I don't think I'm going to have time to really talk about the details of this person's work. But Rav Kook was very much influenced by this idea. And it's how he explains a lot of we could call it maybe applied Kabbalah or Machshava, is all based on the Arizal. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, in his book Inner Space, has also a beautiful explanation of how we could understand the infinite giving rise to the finite. Tzimtzum is that there was a contraction. God sort of, again, I'm simplifying, but he in order to create a finite world, or a world that experiences itself as finite, there had to be a tzimtzum, which is a contraction. God created a space in which there was a vacuum, and that space, that can be where creation exists. And that's how the Arizal approaches this issue. I don't really have time to go through it in depth. I want to finish tonight by talking about a different period entirely, and that is the 19th century. I want to just skip ahead about 300 years or so, and that is another period in the time period of Tzefat, and there's also a famous earthquake which is written about, which I want to touch on as well. So just going further ahead in the packet, you can take a look at a picture here. This is from the 19th century in Tzefat, and I want to focus on one particular character and the earthquake. And that character is referred to now as his work, the Bas Ayin. It's a work that was pretty much not known at all until fairly recently. It's written by Rav Avram Dov of Urvach. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but he is known as the author of the Bas Ayin, and he was a Rav and a Hasidic leader coming from the Chernobyl Hasidic dynasty. And he was interesting because you could see his bio. He lived from 1765 to 1840. He was both a Hasidic Rebbe, a mystical spiritual leader, but also a posek, a halachic decisor, and a rabbi. Very interesting that he makes the decision in his later years to leave Ukraine, where he was a rabbi, and make Aliyah and go to Israel. Why did he do such a thing? Very rare in those times to do it. He had a great love of Eretz Yisrael, and in the Bas Ayin, in his Sefer, he writes about this, how Eretz Yisrael is the epicenter of Jewish life. And it's very interesting, pre-Zionism, this is right, we're talking about the 1830s, he writes about the importance of Lashon HaKodesh, of the Jewish people returning to their national language, and the spiritual power of Hebrew and Lashon HaKodesh, specifically spoken in the land of Israel. That was number one reason why he went, his passion for Israel. Number two reason he went was, tragically, he was never blessed with children, and he believed that if he were to go to the land of Israel, he could potentially merit having a child, just like Avraham Avinu, who, I guess it's apropos, reading about this week's Parsha. At the beginning of the Parsha, Hashem tells him, as Rashi explains, if he goes to the land of Israel, he'll then be able to have a child, because Israel has this special avirah, this special energy, this special spiritual blessing. Unfortunately, he never has a child. And reason number three, which we don't really have time to discuss, according to my good friend Yehuda Geberer, he ran away from Ukraine because he saw a brewing dispute in the Hasidic Chernobyl dynasty, that there was not a clear, there was no clear successor. Thank you for, I needed that word, I appreciate it. No successor for Rav Matal Chernobyl, and he didn't want to be involved in this dispute, and therefore he needed to get out of town. If a rabbi needs to avoid a dispute, what's the easy thing to do? Make Aliyah. It's a nice off-ramp. You could, I'm not talking anything about...
Unless you're in Eretz Yisrael already.
Or if you're in... Right, what do you do then?
Yeah.
No, I'm not talking about anything in particular, but it is seeming to be a historical way that rabbis often can avoid disputes. There was major upheaval in this decade, in the 1830s. There was back and forth between who was the ones who were even controlling. The Ottoman Empire lost control. They had this fellow, I forgot his name already, but he was a leader. There was someone who took control over this the area of the land of Israel, away from the Ottoman Empire for a short period of time. So there were political changes. There was a major Syrian peasant uprising. There was a revolt, and, as I mentioned, a terrible earthquake. So let's talk just for a moment about the earthquake, and then about what this crisis caused, and the outcome that emerged from it. So at the time of the earthquake in Tzefat in 1837, the earthquake affected other cities as well. It wasn't just Tzefat, but we have a major city of Tzefat at the time of 1837. There were a few thousand Jews living in Tzefat. So there were really three different, I guess you could call them, communities. There were the Prushim, the students of the Vilna Gaon. They often refer to themselves as the Prushim, the ascetics, the Misnagdim, or the anti-Hasidim. They had the Sephardim living there, and you have the Hasidim. As we know, the majority of Tzefat was Arab. Ibrahim Pasha, that's who it was. Ibrahim Pasha was the one who usurped control from the Ottomans over that time. Muhammad Ali was first, then we had Ibrahim Pasha. Then, so when the earthquake hits, just to give you some sense of how devastating this earthquake was, most of the people living in Tzefat died. Literally. There was no Richter scale in the 19th century, but based on the estimates and the destruction of what it caused, we assume it was around 7 or above a 7. It lasted only a few seconds, but the devastation was terrible. Yes, so first of all, you have ancient architecture. Second, the city was built on a mountaintop. The streets literally fell on each other, and it was not the greatest time. It was January 1st. The weather was really not good. It was towards the end of the day, and it's the 24th of Teves. It's known, I don't know if it's still considered a fast day in Tzefat, but for many years it was considered a day of mourning, the 24th of Teves, and the roads broke apart. The weather was bad, and therefore there was no lights. There was no people were caught in rubble for weeks and weeks. And we're not talking about you have airplanes and helicopters that could go and come in. It took time for people to get there, even to find out about it. Even those who survived were trapped in the rubble for days and days. So it was a devastating earthquake. Over 90% of the population died. 90% of the population. There were nearly 2,000 Jews who were killed from this earthquake. In Tveria, there were about 600 Jews who were killed. In Lebanon, in Tveria, and Tzefat, and all in total people, we have probably between 5,000 to 7,000 people who died from this earthquake. There's a plaque in the Beis Medrash of the Bas Ayin. If you go to Tzefat, you can see it. It's written there. It says that there was this story with a miraculous story of the Bas Ayin, Rav Avram Dov, or Orva, or I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but the Bas Ayin, Orva, and apparently before the earthquake happened, he asked. It was between Mincha and Mariv. He asked, or around that time, he asked his people praying there to gather to one side of the room. And he said, "You're going to be safe here." The Beis Medrash was completely destroyed, besides for that area in that space. He had a close student, Rav Shmuel Heller, who lost his entire family. They were all killed. Again, that was very typical of the devastation. And he took it upon himself to rebuild, and he did. It took him about 40 years, but he rebuilt the city of Tzefat after this terrible, cataclysmic, devastating tragedy. What ended up happening is an interesting analysis that my friend Yehuda Geber gave. If you understand a little bit, we talked a little bit about this in the previous lecture series. The old yeshuv. The old yeshuv was under the kollel system. The kollel system was basically relying on the Eastern European Jewry to support it, and it was run by a fellow by the name of Hirsch Lerin. Hirsch Lerin was a Dutch banker, and he had a lot of very interesting approaches. Without getting into all the details, he didn't want any Jewish self-sufficiency. This goes back to our discussion before. He wanted the redemption to come. He thought that if the Jews just studied Torah in the Holy Land without any business, no farms, he didn't even want medical schools being open, no doctors, no nothing, that would bring holiness, and that would be sort of bringing towards the redemption, and that was his very, very narrow, rigid approach, and he was one who controlled all of the money. What broke down was after the earthquake. After the earthquake, who gets involved? Moses Montefiore. Moses Montefiore gets involved, and he is one of the people who takes it upon himself to help rehabilitate the entire the land of Tzefat, and because of that, he travels the land of Israel multiple times, and he introduces a new approach, and Moses Montefiore had a different approach about Jewish self-sufficiency. He supported many of the new yeshuvim. He believed in Jewish professionals, and because of his influence on the land of Israel, there was a whole sort of different approach, and the new yeshuv sort of had another ally. So, not to say that this was the only positive, but there was somewhat of a shift that happened in the leadership of the old yeshuv post the earthquake, and this really enabled the rise of Moses Montefiore, which was ultimately the downfall of Hirsch Lerin, because now there was an external financial resource that could be tapped outside of Hirsch Lerin. But again, it all focuses back to that issue of the road towards redemption. How do we bring the Messiah? So those are sort of the, if I would big picture, those are some of the highlights of the city of Tzefat. We had the original mysterious angel speaking through Yosef Karo. We had the dispute of the Smicha dispute, Rabbi Rav, the Maralbach, which could have been this underlying messianism and rigidity, or how do we respond to messianism and false messiahs. Then we had the story of the Arizal, who was only there for a short period of time, but sort of revolutionized Kabbalah, which Hasidic movement is still drawing from. And then we had the terrible or miraculous survival of a few 200, 300 Jews with the leadership of the Bas Ayin and his student, Shmuel Heller, who rebuilt the city, which reintroduced this new figure, or not reintroduced, it introduced this new figure, Moses Montefiore, who was part of this sort of new Israel and self-sufficiency and a different approach to philanthropy in the land of Israel. So that is a little bit of an overall picture of the holy city of Tzefat, the mysterious, historic. Really, there probably wasn't another time in history where you had such a concentrated circle of these rabbinic figures as the 16th century in Tzefat. But just, I guess we'll hold it here, and we'll continue next week. I'm not sure if we'll do Hebron, or maybe Tiberia, or maybe Yerushalayim, I don't know. But we'll continue with another city, Mirz Hashem, next week, Wednesday at 8 p.m. Everyone have a wonderful night, and go Jays.